We are now over 24 hours removed from the NHL trade deadline, and it was a crazy one. Now that I've had some time to really digest everything that went down, I wanted to make a video going over my biggest winners and losers from trade deadline season. I say trade deadline season because I'm not just talking about yesterday, I'm really talking about the last month and a half as a whole. Starting off with some honorable mentions for the winners, I have Seattle, Tampa Bay, Edmonton, and Boston. I think all of those teams did pretty well, but didn't quite make my top 5, and a couple of honorable mentions for the losers, Carolina and Vegas. This was one of the quietest trade deadlines Vegas has ever had. Meanwhile, a lot of other Western Conference contenders loaded up. And when it comes to Carolina, I don't think they did bad in the Mikko Rantanen trade by any means, but they're not a better team today than they were a week ago, and I feel like their chances of coming out of the Eastern Conference this year took a bit of a hit. Now getting into my 5 biggest winners and losers, we will start off with a winner, the Florida Panthers. They are the defending Stanley Cup champions, and I really think you could make the argument that right now on paper their team looks better than it did last season heading into the playoffs. Obviously they made the Seth Jones trade last week, and I'll say the same thing about that trade now as I did in my video breaking down that trade. He fills a need for the Panthers. I think it's a really good fit, and just because his contract isn't great doesn't mean he's a bad player. Getting Chicago to retain salary was obviously huge. Seth Jones at a cap hit of $7 million is a lot easier to stomach than Seth Jones at a cap hit of $9.5 million, especially with the cap going up. After the Seth Jones trade, it left Florida needing a backup goaltender, so they went out and added some goaltending depth in Vitek Vanacek and Kaapo Kähkönen. They also brought in a solid fourth-line center in Nico Sturm, who is one of the best face-off men in the entire NHL, and to top it all off, they had what in my opinion was one of the best additions from the entire trade deadline, acquiring Brad Marchand from the Boston Bruins. Obviously, Florida benefited from Boston wanting to do right by their captain and only send him to the team he wanted to go to, but still, getting Brad Marchand without having to give up a guaranteed first-round draft pick, especially considering how the market was, is absolutely insane. Moving on now to one of my losers, we have the LA Kings. I've been pretty vocal about the fact that I thought LA needed to make a big splash at this year's trade deadline. They're a team that is trying to get over the hump in the playoffs. They've lost in the first round to the Edmonton Oilers for 3 straight years. To me, the Kings' biggest need was a scoring winger, and I guess they did address that need in a sense, acquiring Andrei Kuzmenko, but he's a scoring winger that hasn't really done a whole lot of scoring this season. It is a low-risk move. The Kings really didn't have to give up much at all to bring Kuzmenko in, and he is a guy who had 22 goals last season and 39 the year before. He's obviously got a lot of skill and can put the puck in the net. It's just a matter of him finding that finishing touch again. At the end of the day though, I just don't think this is a move that's going to move the needle all that much for the Kings and tilt the ice in their favor in another potential first round matchup against the Edmonton Oilers. Moving on now to another one of my winners. This is a very obvious one, the Dallas Stars. They were able to go out and acquire a legit superstar forward in Mikko Rantanen, one of the better playoff performers of this generation, as well as sign him to an 8-year extension, and they didn't have to give up Wyatt Johnston or Thomas Harley. I definitely still have my concerns about the right side of their blue line, even when Miro Heiskanen is healthy, but when it comes to their forwards, it's going to be difficult for any team in the NHL to match up with them. I think this is one of the deepest group of forwards in the last 20 years, and they're going to get even deeper come playoff time when Tyler Seguin returns to the lineup. If you think Dallas should be labeled the Stanley Cup favorites right now, I'm not going to argue with you, and the crazy thing is, considering the ages of players like Rantanen, Hintz, Robertson, Johnston, Heiskanen, Harley, and Ottinger, I would say their window for Stanley Cup contention isn't just this season, it's really for the next 6+ years. Moving on now to another one of my losers, we have the Vancouver Canucks, and I have them labeled as a loser not because of the moves they did make. I still think they did pretty well in the return for JT Miller. I liked the Marcus Pettersson addition, but the reason I have Vancouver labeled as a loser is because of the moves or move they didn't make. I just feel like for a team in their current position, hanging on to Brock Besser beyond the trade deadline without an extension is a massive risk. Now, the Canucks GM Patrick Allvin came out and said after the trade deadline that the offers they were getting for Brock Besser just weren't good, but I kind of find that hard to believe considering how crazy the market was. Guys like Anthony Beauvillier and Brandon Tanev went for second-round picks. If the Canucks end up making the playoffs and Besser signs an extension, then I will have been wrong to have them as a loser, but the potential is definitely there for this to blow up in their face. The Calgary Flames are currently just 1 point back of Vancouver for that second wildcard spot. Same goes for the St. Louis Louis Blues. So if the Canucks end up missing the playoffs and Brock Besser leaves in free agency, the decision to hold on to him beyond this year's deadline is going to be looked back at as a very poor one for Patrick Allvin. Next up, I have the Ottawa Senators as another one of my winners. I really like the moves they made yesterday. I said in my trade deadline review that I thought the Fabian Zetterlund trade was one of the most underrated trades of the entire trade deadline. He's going to be a very nice addition to the Senators' middle six, and he's a player that's not only going to help them down the stretch this season in their push for the playoffs, but he has team control. He's an RFA at the end of the season, so he could end up being a pretty important piece for them long term as well. And when it comes to the Josh Norris and Bernard Docker for Dylan Cousins trade, are you giving up a bit of scoring this season going from Norris to Cousins? Yes, but I really believe Dylan Cousins has a higher ceiling than Josh Norris. He's also a little bit younger and a little bit cheaper, and throughout his career so far, for the most part, he has been able to stay healthy, which is obviously a big reason why Josh Norris wasn't really able to live up to his contract in Ottawa, because he struggled to stay on the ice. Moving on now to another one of my losers of the trade deadline, I actually have the Nashville Predators. I feel like they should have taken the same direction that the Boston Bruins took and just blown it up. Now, yes, that's easier said than done, especially considering how many players Nashville has locked up to big money long-term deals, but Boston has a lot of big contracts as well, and they still looked to move on from really anybody they possibly could that would get them solid value in return. Even the players Nashville did trade, I'm not really a huge fan of what they got back. I mean, the return for Nyquist was fine, a second-round pick, but to me, the decision to trade Tommy Novak and Luke Schenn for Michael Bunting is a real head-scratcher, especially when you look at what Pittsburgh was able to flip Luke Schenn for. I feel like it's pretty clear now Nashville wants to at least have another crack at being competitive next season, and if it doesn't go well, you can always look to trade Bunting and O'Reilly at the deadline next year. But honestly, I feel like it would have been in the Predators' best interest to really try and capitalize on what was a seller's market at the deadline this year and accelerate this retool a little bit instead of just kicking the can down the road. Moving on now to another one of my winners, we have the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, an hour before the deadline yesterday, I was ready to label Toronto as one of the biggest losers because they hadn't done anything, but thankfully for Leafs fans, they made two big splashes in the final hour, and they addressed their two biggest needs, acquiring a third-line center in Scott Laughton and a second-pairing right-shot defenseman in Brandon Carlo. Carlo especially, the Maple Leafs have been looking for a defenseman like him for a long time. He's big, good defensively, great on the penalty kill, has a long reach, disrupts passing lanes. Yes, they gave up a lot for him in Fraser Minton and a first-round draft pick, but they were paying not just to acquire the player, but also to get Boston to retain some salary on a guy who still has 2 more years left on his deal following this season. What I like most about what the Maple Leafs did at the deadline this year, again, yes, they filled their two biggest needs, but they didn't spend any premium assets on rentals, which is something we have seen them do a lot in the past. They traded the first-round draft pick for Nick Foligno. They lost in the first round. He left in free agency. They traded the first-round draft pick for Ryan O'Reilly. They did win a round, but they didn't go deep in the playoffs. They lost in 5 in the second round, and then O'Reilly left in free agency. The Leafs aren't going to have to worry about something like that happening again this year because both Scott Laughton and Brandon Carlo have term. The Leafs aren't going to have to go out and look to fill these same needs again next season, which is huge. Next up, I have the Detroit Red Wings as another one of my losers. They didn't do a whole lot. They helped facilitate the Yanni Gourde and Bjorkstrand trade to Tampa Bay. They leveraged their cap space and used up one of their retention spots to get a 4th-round pick. And then yesterday, they went out and traded Joe Veleno for Peter Mrazek and Craig Smith, which still, to me, is a head-scratcher. Not because I think it was a mistake to move on from Joe Veleno. I think he is what he is at this point in his career. But I'm not a huge fan of taking on Mrazek, who has 1 more year left on his deal following this season at a cap hit of $4.25 million. The Red Wings now have 3 NHL goaltenders for the rest of the season in Talbot, Lyon, and Mrazek. I know a lot of Red Wings fans, myself included, were hoping Sebastian Cossa would start to get some consistent NHL minutes next season. Well, now you have 2 goaltenders signed through next season in Mrazek and Talbot already. I'm not going to sit here and say I think Steve Yzerman should have went out and traded first-round draft picks and top prospects for rentals. I think that would have been a mistake, but I still feel like he could have done a little bit more to kind of reward this current team for the run they went on when Todd McClellan first took over. Obviously, they've lost 5 straight now, which is incredibly deflating. This is now the 3rd straight season where the Red Wings' bottom has kind of fell out in early March. Their playoff hopes are on life support. They definitely look like a team that could use some help right now, but obviously the deadline is passed, so they're not going to get it. On top of Steve Yzerman, for the most part, sitting on his hands and not really doing a whole lot, and the one move he made, in my opinion, being a head-scratcher, Jake Wallman fetching San Jose a first-round pick was also a bit of salt on the wound for Red Wings fans at the deadline, I feel like. Moving on now to my final winner from the trade deadline, I have the Colorado Avalanche. Quite a bit of roster turnover for them this season, and everyone I have shown on the screen here, like this isn't even including the deals they made for goaltenders earlier in the season, because I feel like that would be going back a bit too far and it wouldn't really be considered deadline moves at that point. It's pretty crazy how quickly things changed for Colorado. This is a team that at the beginning of the season didn't have a whole lot of depth. Behind Nathan MacKinnon at the center position, they were pretty weak. They also had no goaltending and couldn't get a save. And now you look at their lineup heading into the last, quarter or so of the season and into the playoffs, they have a lot of depth, especially down the middle with McKinnon, Nelson, and Charlie Coyle and Jack Drury. Their goaltending situation is stable with Blackwood and Wedgwood. Ryan Lindgren also really rounds out the left side of their blue line. A 1-2-3 on the left of Devon Toews, Samuel Girard, and Ryan Lindgren is very solid. They no longer have to worry about one of their superstar forwards in Mikko Rantanen potentially leaving in free agency. Martin Necas has obviously been an unbelievable fit, and he's still signed through next season at a cap hit of just $6.5 million. With how Colorado looked for the first month or so of the season, I really didn't view them as one of the top tier Stanley Cup contenders this season. Fast forward to now, and I think they're right there with teams like Florida, Dallas, and Vegas. Dallas could actually end up being their first round matchup, which would feed families. That would be an insane first round series. And now finally finishing up the video with the last of my 5 losers from the trade deadline, I have the Winnipeg Jets. The team that currently sits atop the Western Conference pretty comfortably, and they really didn't do a whole lot at the deadline this year. And the moves they did make were just 2 pretty pricey depth additions, giving up a second round draft pick for both Brandon Tanev and Luke Schenn. I don't even really view Luke Schenn as an upgrade over Colin Miller on their third pair. I do think Brandon Tanev should be a nice fit on their fourth line. He's a player the organization is obviously very familiar with. I'm sure Tanev has a lot of friends in that locker room, and there definitely should be something said about the fact that Tanev and Schenn are 2 guys that aren't going to come in and disrupt chemistry. They're not going to command top power play time or, playing in the top 6 or top 4, anything like that. It should be 2 seamless transitions, and with how the Jets have looked like a well-oiled machine this season, I can see why they didn't want to really try and disrupt the chemistry by going out and trading for, let's say, a really high-end second-line center or something like that. And yes, bringing in guys like Schenn and Tanev is better than doing nothing. I just really feel like after the trade deadline, the Winnipeg Jets' road to coming out of the Western Conference and making the Stanley Cup Finals got a hell of a lot harder. So that is going to wrap up today's video, going over my biggest winners and losers from the NHL trade deadline. As always, I want to know what you guys are thinking, so be sure to let me know what your list would look like down below in the comments. If you made it all this way to the end of the video and you ended up enjoying yourself, please remember to leave a like. It's the best way to let me know that you enjoyed, and it does help out the videos a ton. And most importantly, if this was your first time checking out the channel and you want more NHL content just like this all year round, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will talk to you all again soon.